Hi, Allison. I'm glad that you found time to talk about very interesting and controversial topic of historical and political figures who represented European expansionism and European racism, to be more direct, in the Western Hemisphere. And you wrote about that, and you spoke recently about the need to remove monuments of European pioneers and European expansionists like Christopher Columbus. Also, people have a completely wrong perception of him. They consider him as a great navigator, explorer, but they don't see the fundamental part of his personality and fundamental truth behind great explorations. Great exploration was motivated by political and financial gains and oppression of indigenous population that Europeans faced in New World. So what do you think about the movement which tries to articulate the need of reevaluating of Western history?
Sure. So I think it's essential that we reflect on how history was written and who wrote it, and think about the role of power in that, and recognize that the stories that we're told reflect particular power dynamics of the time and of the past up until now. And so I think when we are told that someone did something heroic in the past, that's coming from a particular point of view and a particular set of power dynamics. And very often there's a lot invested in erasing the violence and the harm that these heroic figures caused. It's also very true and maybe obvious that the people who experienced violence and harm may not be in a position to tell their own stories because they have been killed or marginalized or silenced in some other way. And so I think it's hugely important. I think this is the project of history, actually. Like, real academic history is about uncovering more complex, more inclusive, more multi-layered stories about the past.
Do you think it's related to a segregationist nature of many societies, not only in the States, but in Western Europe? Because we have 4 or 5 different narratives, and of course we have predominant narrative, which is written by, roughly speaking, white elites and white political establishments, which has been creating state politics and still, in a way, monopolizes its position. Do we have a transparent and multi-layered and honest academic discussion between these groups? I mean, you come from academia, and you can say from your own experience and perspective how variety of people who come from different ethnic and racial backgrounds operate within academia, or we still have this kind of first class, second class, third class division?
Yeah, I mean, I think those divisions and hierarchies are, really crucial to thinking about what histories dominate. I think that's a really helpful way to think about it, because it is about race, but it's not just about race. It's also about ethnicity and gender and class. So even in societies where you don't have the division of black and white, that is, I think, not fully unique, but pretty unique to the United States and its long history of slavery, longer than a lot of other countries, you have divisions in a lot of societies. And I think good history is about diversifying the voices that you're hearing from in the past and in the present. And so that's actually a big part of why I became an archaeologist, was because I was really enthralled by the idea that archaeologists look at trash and everyone leaves behind trash. That's different from like writing, which only some people got to write and record and have their stories saved in the past. And so I think thinking about history as a broader project that requires more evidence and requires people who are dedicated to uncovering particular stories. So like, I'm not saying that only women are interested in women's stories, but having women historians has done a lot for history telling the stories of women, just like having people of diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds has diversified the histories that we can tell and teach. So I think we're working on diversifying the narratives of history, but you're right, there is still a lot of segregation and exclusion in academic history, in the practice of history, and in popular history as well.
What do you think should be done in order to erase those boundaries between different ethnic groups or different class groups? Because we didn't mention the class components, which is very important. Talking about Jordan here, lots of people will tell you that the background of local Arabs coming from the West Bank or East Bank makes a big difference. I've been living here for 25 years, and frankly speaking, I only see the class difference more than a regional division between people who come literally from same clans and families. But for some reason, maybe because it's also a political narrative, we all hear on and on about division between West Bankers, East Bankers, Syrians. And in fact, if we study the history of families in this region, we'll realize that most of them operate within the same region of Greater Syria, and they can trace back their origins from all sides. It's not something which is determined. People used to live on the same territory for 200 or 300 years. But what happened 400 years or 500 years ago? So these are artificial divisions, but how would you comment a political division which appeared in 2016 with Trump winning elections? I think that Trump's voters and opponents of Donald Trump are more divided than actually Trump and Republican establishments versus Democratic establishment. Maybe I'm wrong. I think that voters are more divided than political elites, which is always represented by two major parties, and it seems that that system is more or less cemented for a longer time and for maybe coming decades. I don't see the third party.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. We don't really, in the States, we definitely don't have a viable third party option right now. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, lots of people thought that maybe Bernie Sanders would represent the third camp, but it seems that the political establishment is still revolving around Democratic Party and Republican Party. How do you see that division among voters?
I think that's right. I mean, now Trump is talking about starting his own political party because of his dissatisfaction with the moderate Republicans who voted to impeach him and spoke out against him and all of that. So, but the answer is, I think, like with the two-party system, the way it is, the way the money flows, like both parties will do the minimum that they have to keep their most extreme voters under their umbrella. And so there's, I think, a lot of like very minimal appeasement on the part of Democrats towards the progressive left. And I think if the Republican Party shifts back into moderation, there will be appeasement of the Tea Party people, the far right, because you stand to lose a lot. Like, the United States is very divided. It's like not, we have the Electoral College that makes it look even more divided than it is, but on the small scale, you'll find towns like the town I live in is pretty much half and half. It's really very split, and so both parties stand to lose a lot if they lose a large contingent of their voting populace. And then a small minority party will never win. So I've been getting the message my whole life as an American voter that it's throwing away your vote to vote for a third party. And mathematically, logically, that's true in the short term. But I don't know how we're gonna move past these specific two parties in the long term, if that's the ideology that we're living by, is that like you have to stick with the majority to have any sort of political power.
Regarding Christopher Columbus,
Yeah.
can you say for our viewers, what's your opinion about his historical legacy? Because for many of them, as I said, he's a great explorer, adventurer, and a positive figure, although the guy was for Red Indians what some of the worst war criminals were in Europe for their victims.
Right.
Imagine if someone
Right.
in Austria and Germany, and they mentioned that a couple of times, preserves the monuments of Adolf Hitler or Heinrich Himmler. Because of course we can probably find something positive in their biographies. Nothing is black and white, but it would be unacceptable for any sane person to have preserved monuments from Nazi era, like they preserve monuments of well-known slave drivers in the UK who built Bristol and Liverpool on transatlantic slave trade, or Christopher Columbus, whom you mentioned. So can you elaborate more about his role?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a book that I read when I was in high school. It was required reading before my US history class. It's called Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lewin, and I will never forget it. I'm a university professor now, and I still recommend this book to my students. I go back to it all the time because he has a chapter in it where he takes 8 passages from 8 different US history textbooks that tell the story of Christopher Columbus. And he highlights in the book what is true, what is based on evidence, and what is not true. And as you read these passages, you realize that a lot of these passages contradict each other. Like, we don't actually know where he was born. People will say, oh, he was born in Genoa. We don't actually know. He may have been born in Spain, he may have been born in Italy. We don't actually really know where Christopher Columbus was born. People will say, some of the passages will say that he was rich. He came from a wealthy background. Some of the passages will say he was very poor. And both of those passages are doing work. They have a goal. They're either trying to show that he was like a legitimate person, came from a good family, or that he was like very rags to riches, like a self-made man, which is a very important trope or idea in the US. And so as you go through his biography, you realize we don't actually really know that much about the guy. Regarding where he was from, there's not a lot of evidence that he spoke any dialect of Italian. He didn't write in a dialect of Italian. Nobody makes mention of him speaking a dialect of Italian. And so like all of these sorts of like mythologies about Christopher Columbus that are important for people, I think start to crumble a little bit. The most important thing is like not who he was as a child or how he came up in the world, but what he actually did or accomplished. And even if you're looking at it in the most like positive terms, he supposedly discovered the American continent, North American continent. Except that he never actually set foot in North America. He was only on islands. So he didn't actually accomplish that thing that he's so famous for accomplishing. And then he like ushered in an era of exploration that allowed for massive like genocide, environmental degradation, and a huge amount of violence and harm to the people who lived on the American continents. And so I just, once you start like adding it all up, I just really struggle to understand what exactly it is that we even should be celebrating him for, because he didn't actually even accomplish the like exploration that he supposedly is being celebrated for. I got some hate mail after I wrote the op-ed that I did, and somebody wrote to me and was very angry and said, "You should be so grateful for Christopher Columbus, because if not for him, then you wouldn't be here."
Okay,
And I've
big
been
deal.
thinking about that a lot.
Yeah, it's
I've
not the
been thinking
argument.
about, right, I've been thinking about it a lot because I don't actually really care that much. Like,
Yeah,
of course I value my life, of course I value who I am, but like I'm not so wrapped up in my identity as a person who was born in the US in the year, you know, the year that I was born, that like that I would trade that for the massacre of millions of people, the rape of like all of the women that Columbus endorsed raping. Like it just, to me, I don't understand that idea that I should be grateful because he laid the foundation for my family to have immigrated to the US and then me to have been born in New Jersey. Like, I don't care. I don't
of
care
course.
about that.
Maybe they would emigrate to some other place, or they would never emigrate from their original country. But these things are not something that we can control. These are beyond our control, where we were born and
Exactly.
what kind of our ethnic or racial background we came from. This is a ridiculous
Exactly.
statement. That you should be
It's
grateful
ridiculous.
that he in the name of Spanish crown massacred people and sold underage girls into sex slavery.
Exactly. Exactly. And like that's worth justifying so that I, Allison Mickel, could have been come into this world in the year and the way and the place that I did. Like, no, I like then some other person would have been born into my family at this point in time or not. And it doesn't matter. Like
Exactly.
what does matter is that people were like excruciatingly harmed, you know, those hundreds of years ago, and that's that's something that we should reckon with and not ignore and not be like, well, at least I was born. Like what?
Lots of historians would say that we shouldn't judge Christopher Columbus from perspectives of 2021, human rights, gender rights. Of course, we have to understand the context of that period, but I think even for early 15th century, he was pretty harsh. Even
Yes,
back then, yes.
I think this is an
For
important
15th, 16th
argument
century, he
to
was very
hear.
harsh.
Right, right. I think this is an important argument to hear, but also to think about critically and to respond to. So, for one thing, yes, like you're saying, even in his own context, he was harsh. But it's not that I'm asking to judge him by some sort of law that didn't exist then that exists now, or some sort of idea about gender identity. I'm not saying he wasn't sensitive to the use of people's pronouns, or you know, like I'm not suggesting that he should be sensitive to something that truly was not part of the discussion then. Like the morality of slavery was very much, of enslavement was very much a discussion at that point in time. I also think if we're going to say we shouldn't judge him by the standards of this time, we should judge him by the standards of those times, we should also recognize that I don't think the people he was harming were taking that and being like, well, but this is ethical for our time. No, like there were plenty of people not selling women into sex slavery, and the people who were being like massacred and sold into slavery and having their homelands taken from them, and you know, all these things, like they weren't agreeing with those ethics at that time. And so I worry that that sort of argument, oh, we shouldn't judge them by the standards of our time, are saying we should instead judge people in the past by specific white male elite morality of the past, and ignoring that like Black communities being enslaved had systems of morality, that American Indians had systems of morality that did not include their deaths and destruction and theft and kidnapping and rape. Like I just worry about the implications of saying, oh, we shouldn't judge them on the standards of this time, because even if we judge them on the standards of those times, there were people, both those being harmed and white people, Europeans, what have you, who didn't agree with what was being done. So we shouldn't say we should judge them by the dominant, most unethical version of morality that existed at a particular period of time. Should judge them by core human right and wrong that has been part of human societies for a very long time, if not forever.
True.
I mean, thou shalt not kill is like what is like a commandment, right? Like that certainly existed in Columbus's time.
What's right is right, what's wrong is wrong. In any time.
Exactly.
You're not going to correct injustice by doing another injustice.
Exactly.
There was an interesting lecture recently where some political scientists drew the connection between Holocaust and Nakba. Of course, there are two different events in the history. The magnitude is totally different. And whoever, especially in this region, tries to deny suffering of European Jewry and thinking that by doing this they'll push their agenda is completely wrong. And as I said, what's wrong is wrong, what's right is right. If someone suffered in another part of the world, it doesn't mean that it has a moral credit or moral trip to terrorize other people, and vice versa. What do you think about monuments on Southern generals that survived all these decades and centuries? The Civil War was over more than 150 years ago, and they still stay on main squares and on major places in southern cities as well-known statesmen and well-known military figures, although there was the war, which is a little bit absurd. As I said, after 1945, during the process of denazification, they destroyed lots of Nazi monuments in Germany and Austria, but on the other hand, Southern generals survived, and for some people, for some Americans, they're still symbols, positive role models.
Right. Right. So the US has a really specific and kind of horrible history with regard to the memory of our Civil War, which is that most of our monuments and memorials to that time period didn't actually go up in 1865 when the war ended. They went up in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, during the era of Reconstruction. And we have a period called Jim Crow, which is when we had a lot of laws. Yeah, I don't know how international the audience is, so I don't want to.
Yeah, you can explain for them what were Jim Crow.
Yeah, so
because
these were
technically South was the war, but on the other hand, Jim Crow laws preserved the status quo.
Right. So then after the Civil War ended, then Black people who were formerly enslaved were now free. But then the US influenced a number of laws that restricted the movement of Black people, how much they could be employed, their ability to own property, their abilities to access public spaces and buses and schools. And so it was just a set of laws that sort of made, slavery was illegal, but it made inequality part of the law, so that you, as a Black person, couldn't use a lot of the same resources and spaces and infrastructure that white people could. Literally, sometimes you had to leave a whole town. We had sundown towns where if you were a Black person, you had to leave before sundown. Otherwise, it was illegal for you to be there. And white folks would be seen as like well within their rights to kill you. Like this happened. So, So the Confederate memorials and monuments that we have in the US went up alongside these laws. And so in the article that I wrote with my friend of mine, Chelsea Carter, we focused on Confederate memorials in particular, and talked about the harm that they actually do to Black people who have to pass by these monuments every day, and they see enshrined in the public square this person on a pedestal who they know enslaved their ancestors, and the harm that this does to somebody. And some people were like, oh, that's a stretch, you know, like people aren't actually thinking about this. But to that person who might argue that, I would say that's literally what they were designed to do. They went up in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, almost, you know, sometimes like 80 years after the Civil War ended, because in order to instill fear in Black residents of the United States. And so their purpose is not to preserve Southern heritage necessarily,
No,
unless
they
that
wanted
Southern
to
heritage.
remind Black people of their role
Exactly.
within the US society, that they're third or fourth class citizens. And each time they pass by that monument, the guy on the horse will remind them who they are. It's the same if
Exactly. I
someone
mean,
preserves the Nazi figures in Germany and Austria after Second World War. This is my parallel, and we can debate who suffered more. And
I don't think there's any need to. I mean, in the US, people will call, the slavery the Black Holocaust, and I don't think that that's
it is a
a
Holocaust.
stretch.
I
Millions.
firmly believe that they should get reparations for slavery, which lasted more than 200 years. If we talk about Jim Crow laws and beginning of civil rights movements, it's longer than that. Regarding Holocaust, we have 12 years of Nazi terror in Europe, not only in Germany, because they were rounding up and killing not only Ashkenazim and Sephardim in Europe, but other groups, Romas, Slavs, political foes of the regime.
Leftists, intellectuals, the
Everyone who was
handicapped, gays.
everyone who was
Mm-hmm.
who didn't fit their agenda was targeted, persecuted, tortured, and murdered. That was the process, industrialized process, and no one sane in Europe would support rehabilitation of such ideologies, which cost tens of millions of people in Europe and around the world. But still, in the US, it seems that the society didn't face the magnitude of crimes committed during transatlantic slavery and slavery in general. And you have this romanticized picture of Southern aristocracy, well-mannered aristocracy, and all kinds of completely distorted images, which have nothing to do with the reality. It's just maybe one segment of that society which they cherry-picked, ignoring the rest. What we should do with such monuments? Do you think they should be destroyed or placed in a special museum or storage room?
So I'm really open to it. I think as long as they're out of public spaces of like valorization, I'm for it. And whether that happens by governments or by people, I'm a supporter. And part of that actually comes from my background in cultural heritage, because there's those famous images of the Richmond statue of Robert E. Lee, the very famous one, and it's covered in graffiti. And then there's the one of the statue in England who was dragged into the sea. And like those sorts of moments are actually, that's cultural heritage happening. That's cultural heritage at play. I mean, we see in the archaeological record in Egypt, right? We see instances where some pharaohs are like, their names are scratched out. We find evidence of graffiti in the past where people expressed their political views and beliefs. And so I'd actually like, it's sort of maybe a controversial opinion coming from an archaeologist, but I actually kind of think those moments of marking or resisting the monuments are important for showing the change that people are no longer willing to put up with the statue being the thing in the public square. So I say push them into the sea if that's what you feel compelled to do, topple them, whatever, graffiti them. I think that's you know, it's a public space. It's a place where people express themselves publicly. So I'm for that. But the most important thing is taking them down from public spaces. And so if governments and museums don't want to see statues reacted to or treated that way by people, then I think taking them down, putting them in a museum with context, or putting them in storage is a fine option. I think that's a great option available, as long as they're not out causing harm to people on a daily basis.
Yeah, they don't have to traumatize people who are already traumatized. But on the other hand, I'm against vandalizing, and I'm against destruction of fine monuments and fine arts. We had similar trend during the fall of the Berlin Wall, and they destroyed hundreds and thousands of communist monuments in Eastern Europe. And I think it would have been much better if they established a museum for those type of artworks and kept them there if monuments didn't fit with their newly created political agenda, national agenda. So some kind of moderation is necessary in regards of monuments of General Lee and other generals of Southern Army. Do you think that there's a way of establishing a national dialogue between different camps? Is there any way that people who come from political exchange, establishing a political and social dialogue about that part of the past, when people transparently talk about the role of General Lee or Columbus without being hysterical and without being biased in a banal way. Is there possibility of an open dialogue regarding very painful chapters of the history? For us, of course, transatlantic slavery is not very painful. We can take a necessary distance and talk rationally about transatlantic slavery. But for African American or a person who's even now discriminated by the system, it might be more difficult to take a neutral and balanced way of thinking about the past. How you see that as someone who's
and I have to say that that's not necessarily something I would want or would ask for, because I think any situation where we're asking people to engage in a dialogue and to remove emotion or to be moderate about it when it's their family who is harmed, I think that's too much to ask of somebody. I mean, I think if you were to ask like a Jewish person to engage with a contemporary Nazi and have an open dialogue, like I think that's too much to ask of that person.
Yeah, maybe
I do think you're
like
right that open dialogue is important in general. And I think that dialogue is not actively harmful. Yeah.
Can you just repeat what you said, because I haven't heard it.
Yeah, no worries. So I think it's too much to ask people for whom a history is traumatizing or painful to put aside their emotions and be neutral and engage in open dialogue with someone who's supporting the harm of their ancestors. I just think that is unfair and unrealistic to ask for. But I do think open dialogue as a concept is important, and that it is important for people for whom the history is not as directly personal to try and convince people who are defending harmful and violent legacies to see where they're coming from. But I also think the year is 2021. We shouldn't need to be convincing people that figures who raped and killed people are not worth valorizing. And so I end up sort of caught a little bit, because I do think dialogue is important, but dialogue also implies a lot of listening. And it has not been my experience that people who are committed to the Confederate memory are very interested in listening to the facts about the people that they are praising.
Yeah, you think they're blockheads and actually they're not open to any kind of listening of other sides and their narrative and their personal experience, not only historical experience, because they suffer discrimination. They suffer from all forms of discrimination, even long after the end of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Do you think it's how these anomalies can be sorted out? Because you have, if we talk about the US, we're going to have, or we're having divided states of America these days.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's maybe not an answer people will love to hear, or I don't know, but when we think about examples where there has been, I don't know, an effective reckoning with really difficult pasts, there has been very little tolerance from leadership for expressing views that are actively harmful to other people's well-being. So in Germany, like, they have much stricter regulations around hate speech and hate symbols than we do in the US. In the US, we love free speech so much.
True.
So much that, like, wearing a shirt with a swastika on it is like fine. But that's not fine. Wearing a shirt with a black person being hung is like allowed. No. And then I think also, so I think of Germany as one example where they reckoned with a difficult past through a lot of top-down work.
True.
And then I actually think about Rwanda as another example of a place that reckoned with a lot of pain and trauma and division and violence after the Rwandan genocide. And they practiced a lot of restorative justice, which involves a lot of confessions, a lot of confessions, consequences, but not necessarily like from a punitive point of view, like more like community-based consequences, and then earning forgiveness, an emphasis on like, you apologize for what you've done, you confess what you've done, and you wait to see if the community will forgive you. And I know that we're talking about with the Rwandan genocide, that happened in the years like following it. So there wasn't like hundreds of years, and it wasn't like in the US and people are like, well, it's not me who enslaved anyone. But I think restorative justice is really important for what I think the basis of restorative justice is that, like, you have to be held accountable for your actions, and also forgiveness is important. Like, both of those things are true at once. And I think that if the US could embrace that mentality, I think we could get beyond a lot of the reactionary responses that come from people who are like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. Like, why should I have to pay reparations? Well, because harm was done. Like, harm was done, and there needs to be
It's a
accountability
gesture.
and
Reparation is a gesture.
yeah,
By paying
yeah,
reparation, you distance yourself from ancestors who may have been violent, who may have benefited from transatlantic slavery or any kind of genocide committed by white Europeans,
exactly.
whether they came from the UK initially or they came from other parts of Europe. But by doing this, you distance yourself from that kind of mindset.
Yes,
I
and again,
personally
it's about
don't believe
accountability.
in collective guilt. Absolutely, I'm against collective guilt, and I'm against collective merit as well. Each of us is responsible for what they do. I'm not responsible for what my sister and my brother are doing at their work or in their personal life. But on the other hand, by distancing and doing an opposite thing, or by acknowledging what happened and trying to minimize the pain and minimize the anguish that these people feel, we prove that we have nothing to do with harmful past. On the contrary, we are giving the opposite example by showing solidarity with oppressed people, regardless of their ethnicity or race. It's completely irrelevant because racism is unfortunately present in every community in the world, not only white community, but for historical record, of course, white Europeans were the most successful
Exactly, exactly.
colonizers, and there are plenty of evidence for that. Whoever tries to deny the white privilege is also, in a way, a compass in that.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, is that when you say, oh, well, my ancestors did that, it wasn't me, blah, blah, blah. I don't think slavery is right. And yet, but I don't support reparations. You are saying that you might not don't agree with the act of slavery, but you do appreciate your tacit benefit,
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
the benefit that you've had from it, like by
Well,
like
I hear this from liberals. Some liberals will say that
yes,
in the state. You say, okay,
yes,
especially when they criticize the role of Roman Catholic Church, not only in the New World but in Europe, because they were very much politically involved in all kinds of bigotry and interconfessional conflicts. Those good Roman Catholics will reply, yeah, but we have good examples of pious people and priests and groups within the Roman Catholic Church who were involved with charitable work. Yes, but it's a complex picture. It's a multi-layered mosaic, and if you're different, you should be more critical. You shouldn't just cherry pick what suits you and ignore what was wrong within the same organization.
exactly. And liberals especially love to say, well, I understand that this is wrong, but what can we do about it? And when the what can we do is difficult or uncomfortable for them, they often will back off of those morals that they're happy to like speak about. Like they'll say Black Lives Matter, they'll hold the signs, but if it comes to giving up money or thinking about alternatives to police or increasing funding for public education and decreasing charter school funding, like there's all of these issues that would make especially white liberals maybe slightly uncomfortable for some amount of time, but they won't do it, even though they'll stand up in the streets and be like, oh, I believe theoretically that Black Lives Matter. So this is a common issue in the US. And anywhere. But
if we go back to roots of liberalism, it was a white close club.
Yeah.
Wasn't universal liberalism or universal acknowledgement of human rights, but was reserved for white super rich people. And even if we talk about the current American policy or politics between two parties, it's a playground for plutocracy, not for ordinary people. And this is why there's no sign of a third party
Right.
in the US political system. Unfortunately, it's not only the US trend. In many countries in the world, we have two parties or sometimes one party that absorbs rejects and politicians
Mhm.
from other groups, and they dominate the scene, which is on the long run harmful for the society. They have a
Yeah.
monopoly and they can do whatever they want economically, socially, in the field of culture, in the field of science, because they're not challenged by serious political groups. They cemented their status. I personally believe that open dialogue, particularly amongst intellectuals, because ordinary people in general are not educated enough, they're not rational enough to take a healthy distance and discuss about these painful issues and traumatic issues in a more balanced way. I'm coming from the region which was affected by sectarian violence. We're talking about the same ethnic group, which is split at least into three major confessions, and they've been fighting because of politicized religion. Politicized religion is one of the most acute problems in the Middle
Yeah.
East, in Europe, everywhere. It literally splits people from the same family on 2-3 different camps that fight for hundreds of years. And the problem, especially with ordinary people, is that they can only see the harm done to them, but they'll never acknowledge atrocities that they committed against other groups. So I believe that intellectuals, particularly historians and academics like yourself, should open the channel and discuss in a precise scientific way about each crime, each victim. They should come with accurate figures, not like in my area where they always bargain about victims from recent past. I'm not talking about something committed 500 years ago, but even 70 years ago. If we talk about the Second World War, they come with completely different figures, from 700,000 casualties to 5,000 casualties. But it's another story, and maybe we can once sit and talk about that. If you want to comment more about monuments in the States and Black Lives Matter movement, what do you think? Does that movement have a perspective? Black Lives Matter at this moment. It seems that right now they're a bit quiet.
I don't know that they're so quiet. I think people in the US just in this moment are waiting to see what's going to happen. Like, I think we are coming out of 4 years of trauma, and I think that we have all been traumatized. Even if you supported Trump, you were traumatized by we had an inept government that didn't care for human life for 4 years, and whether you supported that government or not, it's traumatic to have been in that country for the last 4 years. And so I think we're all sort of like holding our breath, but not in a bad way, like holding our breath to see what this new system is going to do and what it's going to look like. I think so we just got the verdict on Derek Chauvin just a few weeks ago. And so I think we're just sort of, I don't want to say waiting to see, because like, I think until there's really systemic, massive change in how we go about public safety and how we are represented in government and whose voices we take seriously, like I think things aren't going to change. So we're not waiting to see if there's another police killing, because there will be. There will absolutely be another police killing. That's not the question. I think the question is, what is this new leadership going to do about it? And what's the most effective way to show that we're still watching, we're still listening, we're still here to put pressure? So I don't know. Yeah, so I get that it seems like a little bit quiet, but I think it's just about reorienting the strategy around this new reality that none of us are sure exactly what it is.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I'll stop here, but we're going to continue talking about books that you published, which are it's a totally different topic from what we spoke today. Of course, we're going to follow the US political scene. I'm not a big fan of neither Democrats nor Republicans. I think they support the plutocracy and military-industrial complex, but
and unfettered capitalism. And
they support.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
So I don't have sympathy for neither Trump nor Biden, and for many years I was mocking some of my friends in Serbia who thought that the US will become isolationist if Donald Trump is elected, and of course it didn't happen. It won't happen that Biden will support African Americans or ethnic minorities. Even I don't like to use the term minority, because these people are an integral part of the US society. They've been there from the very beginning. And to call them minority means that they're some kinds of aliens and some kind of non-registered entity, which is completely out of mind. So I understand that the US is created as a melting pot, but on the other hand, they still categorize different ethnic groups, and they have in their political language all kinds of terms for underprivileged groups, not minorities. For me, they're underprivileged, not newcomers to the continent or to the US as a state. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're super busy.
Thank you.
And we'll keep in touch. All the best.
Sounds good.